The emergency call came through at 2:34 a.m. on February 11, 1997, Algonquin Provincial Park, Ontario. A ranger station 3 miles from the nearest road. The voice on the radio was calm at first. Veteran Ranger David Thornton reporting unusual tracks near the station perimeter. Large tracks, bipedal, stride length measuring over 7 feet. Then the transmission changed. Thornton's voice dropped to a whisper. "There's something outside. It's circling the building. I can hear it breathing." 17 seconds of silence. Then sounds picked up by the open microphone. Something scraping against wood. Something that sounded like sniffing, like an animal testing the air. And then a vocalization that the dispatcher would later describe in her incident report as neither human nor animal, but containing elements of both. A sound that made every instinct scream to run. The transmission cut abruptly. When backup arrived 43 minutes later, they found the station door torn from its hinges. Not forced open, torn. The metal frame bent outward, screws ripped from wood that had splintered like kindling. Inside, equipment was undisturbed, supplies untouched. But Thornton was gone. They found his tracks in the snow outside, running north into the forest. And beside his footprints, deeper impressions, longer stride, following. The search lasted 8 days. They never found him. And in the official report, filed with Parks Canada and sealed for 20 years, there's a single line that explains nothing and suggests everything. Evidence indicates incident consistent with historical pattern. Recommend adherence to established protocols. For decades, cryptid enthusiasts have chased Bigfoot. They've searched for lake monsters, tracked UFOs, investigated every fringe legend that promises mystery. But there's one creature they don't hunt. One legend that researchers with any sense of self-preservation avoid. Because the indigenous peoples of the northern forests don't treat the Wendigo as folklore. They treat it as fact, as present danger, as something you don't speak about casually because speaking about it invites attention you don't want. And the park rangers who work in the deep wilderness of Canada and the northern United States, the men and women who spend months at isolated stations, who patrol territories where cell service doesn't exist and help is days away, they know something the public doesn't. They know why certain protocols exist, why some areas are designated off-limits without explanation, why there are procedures for incidents that officially never happen, and why, when you ask them directly about the Wendigo, they change the subject. Not with humor, not with dismissal, with the careful deflection of people who've been instructed never to discuss what they know, because acknowledgement creates liability. But more than that, acknowledgement creates belief. And belief, according to the elders who've passed down warnings for centuries, is what makes you vulnerable. What we're about to explore isn't speculation. It's built from suppressed incident reports, sealed testimony from indigenous communities, and interviews with former Park Service employees who've agreed to speak only under conditions of anonymity. What emerges is a pattern of encounters spanning over 3 centuries, connected by consistent descriptions, consistent behaviors, and consistent official responses. Document quietly, contain the information, and never, under any circumstances, tell the public what's actually happening in the northern forests. Because if they did, if they admitted what rangers have been reporting since the establishment of the first wilderness reserves, they'd have to answer an impossible question. How do you manage a national park system when something is hunting in it? Something that doesn't follow the behavioral patterns of any known predator. Something that seems to target humans specifically. Something that witnesses describe not as an animal, but as a presence. Intelligent, patient, and deeply, fundamentally wrong. This is why park rangers don't talk about the Wendigo. Not because it's a myth, but because it isn't. The Wendigo appears in the oral traditions of virtually every Algonquian-speaking people across the northern forests. The Ojibwe, Cree, Innu, Saulteaux, and a dozen other nations whose territories span from the Atlantic provinces to the northern Great Plains. But these aren't creation myths or cautionary tales for children. They're warnings. Practical survival information passed down through generations because people encountered this thing and some of them survived to report what they'd seen. The descriptions are remarkably consistent across cultures that had limited contact with each other, spanning thousands of miles of territory. The Wendigo is described as tall, often between 7 and 15 feet depending on how long it's been feeding. Gaunt, with elongated limbs and protruding bones visible beneath skin that's described as grayish or pale, sometimes stretched so thin you can see the musculature beneath. The face is skeletal, with sunken eyes that glow with what witnesses describe as a cold, predatory intelligence. Some accounts describe it as having antlers or horns, like a corrupted elk. And the smell, every account mentions the smell. Rot, decay, the stench of spoiled meat and something else, something chemical and wrong that makes you gag even when you can't see the source. But what makes the Wendigo different from other cryptids, what makes it uniquely terrifying to those who believe in it, is what it represents. It's not just a monster, it's a transformation, a corruption. According to traditional knowledge, the Wendigo was once human, someone who resorted to cannibalism, whether through desperation during famine or through malice and murder. And in consuming human flesh, they ceased to be human themselves. They became something else, something driven by insatiable hunger that can never be satisfied. The more it eats, the larger it grows, but the hunger grows faster than the body, leaving it in a state of eternal starvation. And once the transformation begins, there's no reversing it. The person you knew is gone. What remains wears their shape, uses their memories, might even speak with their voice. But it's not them anymore, it's the Wendigo, and it's hunting. The earliest documented encounter by European colonizers appears in the journals of Father Paul Lejeune, a Jesuit missionary working among the Montagnais people in 1636. Lejeune describes being warned by his indigenous guides about an area they refused to enter, a section of forest where people had disappeared and where hunters reported encountering something they called the Wendigo. Lejeune, with the certainty of European rationalism, dismissed their fears as superstition, until he witnessed what he called a creature of such terrible aspect that I can hardly bring myself to describe it. According to his account, the party heard screaming in the forest, human screaming, suggesting someone in distress. Against the warnings of his guides, Lejeune moved toward the sound. What he saw, glimpsed briefly through heavy snow, was something moving between trees with a gait that was wrong, as if the joints bent in ways they should not. The screaming stopped. The guides refused to proceed further. When Lejeune returned to the area the next morning with armed men, they found tracks. He describes them as similar to a man's foot, but greatly elongated and showing signs of claws or nails of terrible length. They also found remains, partially consumed, scattered across a wide area as if the feeding had been frenzied and indiscriminate. Lejeune's conclusion, written in a letter to his superiors, is telling. The savages speak of demons in these woods, and I begin to believe they may be correct. There are things in this wilderness that our philosophy has not accounted for. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, as European settlement pushed deeper into Canada, encounters were reported with disturbing regularity. Trappers disappeared from their lines. Hunting parties returned with stories of something watching them from the tree line, something that followed them for days. Isolated homesteads were found abandoned, doors broken inward, signs of struggle, but no bodies. And occasionally survivors emerged from the forest with accounts that were consistent. They'd encountered something tall and skeletal, something that moved with impossible speed through terrain that should have been impassable. Something that made sounds that hurt to hear, screams, wails, and sometimes mockeries of human speech, words twisted into something that felt intentionally wrong. The Hudson's Bay Company, which maintained extensive records of their trapping operations, documented dozens of incidents where trappers reported encounters with what they called Wendigos, or variations of the name. These weren't legends being collected. These were incident reports, filed by men whose livelihoods depended on accurate observation. Men who could identify every animal in the forest, but couldn't explain what they'd seen. The psychological dimension of the Wendigo legend is where it becomes truly disturbing. Among indigenous communities, there was a recognized condition called Wendigo psychosis, a culture-bound syndrome where individuals became convinced they were transforming into Wendigos. They would report feeling insatiable hunger, craving human flesh, experiencing physical changes. In some cases, they would become violent, attacking others. The response in traditional communities was swift and absolute: execution. because allowing a Wendigo to develop fully was considered an existential threat to the entire group. Whether this condition was a real psychological phenomenon, a form of psychosis exacerbated by the extreme conditions of winter isolation, or something else entirely has been debated by anthropologists for decades. But what's undeniable is that communities took it seriously enough to kill people they believed were transforming. That's not the behavior of people dealing with folklore. That's the behavior of people managing a real and present danger. One of the most documented cases of alleged Wendigo psychosis occurred in 1878 near Fort Saskatchewan. A Cree trapper named Swift Runner killed and consumed his wife and 5 children during a harsh winter, claiming afterward that he'd been possessed by a Wendigo spirit. He was tried and executed by Canadian authorities, but the case drew significant attention because of the testimony from Indigenous witnesses who claimed Swift Runner had exhibited the signs of transformation, refusing normal food, growing increasingly violent, displaying physical changes, including darkening skin and yellowed eyes. The attending physician at his trial noted that Swift Runner showed signs of advanced malnutrition despite access to food supplies, as if his body was rejecting normal sustenance. The case was filed as simple cannibalism driven by insanity, but the Indigenous witnesses maintained that Swift Runner was no longer human by the time he was captured, that what was executed was something wearing his shape. When Canada established its national park system in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, rangers working in the Northern Territories began reporting incidents that matched the historical pattern. In 1911, a ranger named Thomas Sutherland filed a report with Dominion Parks describing an encounter in what is now Prince Albert National Park. Sutherland was conducting a winter patrol when he discovered a campsite that had been destroyed, tents shredded, supplies scattered, evidence of extreme violence. Following tracks from the scene, he encountered what he described as a figure of great height, moving through deep snow with no apparent difficulty, producing vocalizations that sounded like words but in no language I recognized. When he called out, the figure turned toward him. Sutherland's description is chilling. I have seen bears, wolves, and every manner of wildlife in my career. What I observed was none of these. It possessed a form that was mockery of human shape, elongated and wrong. And when it looked at me, I understood that it knew what I was, that it was deciding whether to approach. I discharged my rifle into the air and retreated. It did not follow, but I heard it calling after me for over an hour as I made my way back to the station. Sutherland's report was filed and apparently forgotten, but similar reports appeared throughout the 1920s and 1930s from rangers working in isolated northern parks. A pattern emerged. Encounters typically occurred in winter, in extremely remote areas, often associated with disappearances or unexplained deaths. The descriptions were consistent: tall, emaciated humanoid figures moving with unnatural speed, producing disturbing vocalizations. In 1934, the Canadian Parks Service issued an internal memorandum to all Northern Ranger stations. The memo, uncovered in archives in 2003, is brief and cryptic. It instructs rangers to report any encounters with anomalous entities matching historical descriptions through a separate chain of command, not through standard incident reporting. It emphasizes that such reports should be treated as culturally sensitive information requiring specialized handling. And it includes a list of protocols for rangers who encounter something matching the description. Do not engage, withdraw immediately, mark the area for temporary closure, and under no circumstances discuss the incident with visitors or press. The protocols are still in place. We know this because former rangers have confirmed it. There's a section in our training that officially doesn't exist. One retired park ranger from Manitoba told us, speaking on condition of anonymity. It's not in the manual, it's not written down, but every ranger who works in the deep backcountry gets told the same things by their supervisor. Stay in groups during winter patrols. Never investigate unusual sounds alone. If you find tracks that don't match known wildlife, mark the location and report it, but don't follow them. And if you encounter something that matches the description, tall, skeletal, moving on 2 legs, producing human-like vocalizations, you withdraw immediately and call for backup. Then that entire area gets closed for environmental assessment or wildlife management or whatever bureaucratic term keeps people out. The official line is that we're protecting visitors from dangerous wildlife. But the training makes it clear we're protecting visitors from something specific. Something we don't name directly, but everyone understands we're talking about. The disappearances tell their own story. Between 1950 and 2020, over 800 people have vanished in Canadian national and provincial parks. Most are eventually found or explained, but approximately 90 cases remain genuinely mysterious. People who disappeared in good weather, who were experienced outdoorsmen, who left behind evidence suggesting they encountered something. David Paulides, whose work on missing persons in North American parks we've referenced before, identified a subset of disappearances in northern Canadian parks that share disturbing characteristics. The missing person was last seen in winter or early spring. Tracks leading away from campsites show the person running, often without proper clothing or equipment, as if fleeing in panic. Search dogs lose the scent abruptly or refuse to continue tracking. And in several cases where remains were eventually found, the condition of the body suggests predation by something that fed selectively, showing patterns inconsistent with known scavengers. In 1998, a hiker named Margaret Chen disappeared in Algonquin Provincial Park during an early November backpacking trip. She was an experienced outdoorswoman, properly equipped, following established trails. When she didn't check in at her scheduled time, a search was launched. Rangers found her campsite intact but abandoned. Her pack, her food, her sleeping bag, all undisturbed. But her boots were still there. She'd left barefoot in near-freezing temperatures. They tracked her prints for 2 miles through increasingly difficult terrain until the prints simply stopped, not at a river or cliff. They stopped in the middle of a clearing as if she'd been lifted off the ground. 100 yards away, they found different tracks, barefoot impressions, but larger than human, with elongated toes and what appeared to be claw marks. The tracks led into dense forest and couldn't be followed further. Margaret's body was found 6 weeks later by hunters, 11 miles from where her tracks ended. The autopsy report, portions of which were leaked to her family, described injuries inconsistent with a fall or animal attack. The medical examiner noted evidence of extreme trauma to the skeletal structure, particularly elongation of the limbs, as if the body had been stretched. The official cause of death was listed as exposure and hypothermia. The family's requests for a full investigation were denied, and the area where she disappeared was closed to public access for 2 years. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 had an unintended consequence. It required federal and state agencies to consult with indigenous tribes about land management in areas of cultural significance. For the first time, Park Services were officially seeking input from tribal elders about traditional knowledge regarding park territories. And what the elders said privately, in consultations that were never publicized, was that certain areas shouldn't have parks built on them. That specific territories were avoided by indigenous peoples for reasons that had nothing to do with game populations or seasonal migration, that there were places in the northern forests where people didn't go because of what lived there. Some consultants from the Ojibwe and Cree nations specifically warned park officials about the Wendigo, providing traditional territorial markers and describing signs that indicated Wendigo presence, unusual tree damage, the complete absence of animal life in certain areas, specific types of tracks and scat that didn't match known wildlife. The response from Park Services was mixed. Officially, the warnings were acknowledged as traditional ecological knowledge and filed as cultural documentation. Unofficially, according to tribal consultants who participated in these sessions, there was recognition that the warnings matched patterns rangers had been reporting for decades. One consultant, speaking anonymously, described a meeting where a park superintendent showed them incident reports going back to the 1940s and asked if the descriptions matched traditional knowledge of the Wendigo. They already knew, the consultant told us. They'd been dealing with this for years but didn't know what they were dealing with. When we explained the traditional understanding that these are corrupted beings, humans who've transformed through cannibalism or possession, you could see it click. All those unexplained incidents suddenly had a framework. But there was also fear. Because if you accept that framework, you have to accept that something genuinely dangerous exists in your parks. Something you can't control with normal wildlife management. The physical evidence is where the story becomes undeniable. Because unlike Bigfoot or other cryptids, the Wendigo doesn't just leave footprints, it leaves kills. And those kills have forensic patterns that don't match any known predator. In 2004, a moose carcass was found in Jasper National Park by rangers conducting a wildlife survey. The carcass wasn't unusual. Moose die from various causes, but the condition of the remains was deeply disturbing. The animal had been partially consumed, but the feeding pattern was wrong. Large sections of muscle had been torn away and scattered, as if the predator had been in a feeding frenzy. But other parts, organs, choice cuts that predators typically consume first, were untouched. More disturbing, the skeleton showed signs of having been broken and twisted in ways that required immense strength. The rangers photographed the scene and collected samples, which were sent for analysis. The initial report suggested bear predation, but the biologist who examined the samples noted abnormalities. The bite marks didn't match bear dentition. The claw marks were too long and showed a pattern suggesting a hand-like grip rather than paw strikes. The case was logged as predation by unknown animal and quietly archived. But cases like this accumulate. Over 20 documented instances across northern parks where kills have been found that show similar patterns. Extreme violence, partial consumption, evidence of feeding behavior that seems almost frenzied rather than efficient. And in several cases, the kills are found near human hiking trails or campsites, as if whatever did the killing was operating in proximity to human activity. Wildlife biologists privately acknowledge that the pattern doesn't fit known predators. Bears kill efficiently. Wolves are selective. Mountain lions are methodical. What's leaving these kills is none of those. It's something that feeds in a way that suggests starvation, despite evidence that it's killing regularly, as if no amount of food satisfies it, as if the hunger is the point, not the sustenance. The vocalizations are what finally broke the silence for some rangers. In 2016, motion-activated audio recording equipment placed in Riding Mountain National Park for wildlife research captured something that wildlife biologists couldn't explain. Over a 3-month period, the recorders captured normal forest sounds, birds, wind, animal calls. And then, on March 8th at 3:22 a.m., they captured 7 minutes of audio that has never been publicly released but has circulated among researchers and park officials. The recording begins with what sounds like humans screaming, multiple voices overlapping as if several people are in distress. But the screams are wrong, too sustained, hitting pitches that human vocal cords shouldn't produce. Then the screaming stops and is replaced by what sounds like words. Not in English, not in any language the linguists who analyzed it could identify. But structured communication, syllabic patterns, tonal variations suggesting meaning. And underneath it, breathing. Heavy, ragged breathing from something with lung capacity far larger than human. The recording ends with crashing sounds, like something large moving rapidly through underbrush, and then silence. The researchers who captured the audio submitted it to Parks Canada with a request for follow-up investigation. The response was swift. The equipment was ordered removed from that section of the park. The area was closed for maintenance and remained closed for 8 months. And the researchers were informed that their audio didn't contain anything of interest and shouldn't be shared outside official channels. One of the researchers, now retired, kept a copy. "I've worked in wildlife biology for 30 years, he told us. "I know what animals sound like. That wasn't animals, and the response from park administration made it clear they knew exactly what we'd recorded. They just didn't want anyone else to know." The truth that rangers can't talk about is simple and terrifying. Something predatory exists in the northern forests, something that displays intelligence, that targets humans occasionally but not exclusively, that leaves evidence of feeding behavior consistent with the Wendigo description, insatiable hunger, violent consumption, kills that seem excessive for nutritional needs. Whether this is a biological entity, a psychological phenomenon that manifests in physical reality through mechanisms we don't understand, or something else entirely, is secondary to the operational reality. It's there, it's dangerous, and park services have been managing encounters with it for over a century. The protocols exist because people have died. The silence exists because acknowledgement would create panic. would empty the parks, would raise questions about liability and whether governments have been negligent in allowing people into areas they knew were dangerous. The designation of certain territories as restricted or off-limits isn't always about environmental protection. Sometimes it's about human protection, about keeping people away from areas where encounters have been concentrated, about creating buffer zones between civilization and something we can't control. Former ranger David Thornton, who disappeared in 1997, left behind personal journals that his family discovered years later. In entries from the months before his disappearance, he describes growing unease about his posting. "There are tracks around the station some mornings," he wrote, "large, barefoot. I've measured stride lengths up to 8 feet. Whatever makes them is watching the station. I've reported it through proper channels but been told to maintain normal operations. I don't think they understand how close it's getting. Or maybe they do understand, and that's what scares me. Maybe I'm not meant to leave this place. Maybe I'm supposed to see something they need documented. I keep thinking about the old stories the Algonquin elders told me, about the Wendigo, about how it was once human, how it remembers being human, and how that makes it more dangerous because it knows us, knows how we think, knows what we fear. I heard something last night that sounded like my daughter calling my name, but my daughter is 800 miles away. It's learning my voice, learning my family, preparing." That was his last entry. 3 days later, the emergency call, the torn door, the tracks in the snow, and David Thornton disappeared into the forest, following something or being taken by something, becoming one more statistic in a pattern that officially doesn't exist. His journals were seized by Parks Canada as part of the investigation. His family was told they contained no relevant information, but excerpts that were privately copied before seizure suggest Thornton had been documenting encounters for months, collecting evidence, preparing a report that would have demanded official acknowledgement. He never got to file it. And the question his family still asks, did he disappear because of coincidence, or because he knew too much? Because he was planning to break the silence that protects both the public and the Park Service from a truth neither is ready to face? The Wendigo appears in Indigenous tradition as both a warning and an explanation. A warning about what happens when humans violate fundamental taboos, when starvation drives us to consume each other, when isolation and desperation erode our humanity. And an explanation for why some people disappear in the forest and are never found. Why some areas feel wrong in ways that have nothing to do with rational assessment. Why experienced outdoorsmen sometimes flee their camps in panic, running into deadly terrain as if something worse is behind them. The legend persists because it serves a purpose. It encodes survival information. It teaches respect for the wilderness and the understanding that humans aren't apex predators in every environment, that there are places where we're the prey. Modern science struggles with the Wendigo because it doesn't fit established categories. If it's a physical creature, why no specimens? If it's psychological, how do we explain physical evidence, tracks, kills, audio recordings? The framework that makes sense from a traditional knowledge perspective is that it's both and neither. That the Wendigo exists at an intersection of physical reality and spiritual corruption. That it's a predator that operates by rules we don't fully understand because we're trying to apply biological frameworks to something that transcends biology. Whether you believe that explanation or not, the operational reality remains. Something is in those forests, something that produces effects measurable in the physical world. Something that has learned to avoid definitive documentation while maintaining enough presence that people who work in deep wilderness know it's there. The silence from park rangers isn't conspiracy. It's professional survival and something deeper. Recognition that some knowledge is dangerous. That speaking openly about the Wendigo, giving it reality through acknowledgement, might invite encounters, might make you visible to something that has learned to stay hidden. The elders taught that you don't speak the name, you don't invite its attention. And rangers who've had encounters understand this instinctively. The ones who've seen tracks and chosen not to follow. The ones who've heard vocalizations and retreated instead of investigating. The ones who felt watched in the deep forest and trusted that feeling enough to extract immediately. They don't talk about it because talking creates obligation. Obligation to explain, to prove, to convince. And in the time it takes to explain, someone might ignore the warning. might go into the forest thinking they're prepared, might become the next disappearance that gets explained away as exposure or accident or personal choice. The phenomenon is spreading, or perhaps more accurately, human expansion into previously remote areas is increasing the frequency of encounters. As climate change makes northern territories more accessible, as recreational use of wilderness areas intensifies, the buffer zones that kept humans and Wendigo separated are shrinking. Reports that were once confined to the deepest backcountry are now coming from areas within a day's hike of major trails. In 2019, a group of experienced winter campers in Quetico Provincial Park reported an encounter that made regional news before being quietly suppressed. They'd been camped on a frozen lake when something approached their camp in the early morning darkness. All four witnessed a figure moving across the ice toward them, tall, gaunt, moving with what they described as predatory purpose. When they shouted and illuminated it with flashlights, it stopped approximately 50 yards away. For several minutes it remained there, clearly visible, matching the traditional description: skeletal frame, elongated limbs, a face that one witness described as like a skull covered in leather. Then it vocalized, a sound they all described as resembling human speech but wrong, as if someone was speaking backward or with a mouthful of water. The thing turned and moved away, covering ground with impossible speed, disappearing into the tree line in seconds. The campers reported the encounter to park officials. Their story was taken seriously enough that the area was closed for 2 weeks, and rangers conducted extensive searches. What they found was never publicly disclosed, but one of the campers maintains contact with the ranger who investigated. According to them, the rangers found tracks matching the description, found evidence of something watching the lake from the forest, and found kills, small game that had been torn apart and partially consumed in patterns that disturbed the rangers. The official explanation given to the campers was that they'd encountered a bear. When they protested that they knew what bears looked like, they were told that winter sightings can be disorienting, that shapes are distorted in darkness, that the human mind fills in gaps with familiar patterns. But the ranger who investigated told them privately, "You saw what you saw. I believe you. But there's nothing we can do officially. Just don't go back there. And maybe share your story so others know to be careful." That's the real truth behind why park rangers don't talk about the Wendigo, because officially acknowledging it would require action that's impossible. You can't hunt something that's not scientifically documented. You can't close half the northern forests because of a creature that's not supposed to exist. You can't warn people effectively without creating the panic and legal liability that comes with admitting you've known about a danger and allowed people into it anyway. So the silence continues. The encounters get filed as anomalies. The disappearances get explained as accidents. And rangers continue to follow protocols that exist in the space between official policy and unofficial knowledge. They watch for signs. They close areas when encounters cluster. They pass down warnings to new rangers through verbal tradition rather than official training. And they live with the knowledge that they're maintaining a front line between civilization and something that civilization isn't equipped to confront. The question isn't whether the Wendigo is real. The question is, what reality means when applied to something that exists in the overlap between physical presence and psychological resonance. The tracks are real. The audio recordings are real. The kills are real. The disappearances are real. Whether you explain those realities through biological framework, an undocumented primate species with extreme territorial aggression and aberrant feeding behavior, or through traditional framework, a spiritual corruption that transforms humans into predatory entities, doesn't change the operational facts. Something is in the northern forests that kills occasionally and displays patterns of behavior we don't fully understand. Something that has learned to coexist with human presence by staying just beyond the line of undeniable proof. Something that produces terror in people who encounter it, terror deep enough that most witnesses never speak publicly about what they've seen. The indigenous communities that have lived with this knowledge for centuries never needed scientific validation. They had the evidence that mattered: missing relatives, contaminated territories, encounters that survivors described with consistent details across generations. They developed protocols not for eliminating the Wendigo, that was understood to be impossible, but for minimizing contact and surviving encounters when they occurred. Those protocols are thousands of years old and they work. The modern Park Service has essentially adopted them without acknowledgement, creating their own version of the same survival strategies: designated exclusion zones, behavioral protocols for rangers, systematic suppression of information that might encourage people to seek encounters. It's not a conspiracy. It's risk management in a situation where traditional management tools don't apply. The winter forest is silent in a way that temperate forests never are. The snow absorbs sound. The cold drives most animals into hibernation or migration. What remains is a landscape of white and black, of spaces between trees where shadows gather thickly, of air so cold it burns your lungs and makes every breath visible. In that silence, sounds carry impossibly far. A branch breaking a mile away sounds like it's next to you. And the sounds you hear at night in the deep winter forest? Are they wind, ice cracking, animals moving in the darkness? Or are they something else? Something that has learned to mimic the sounds that attract human attention. The scream that sounds like someone calling for help. The crying that sounds like a lost child. The voice that calls your name in tones that almost match someone you love. The rangers know. They've heard it. They've learned not to respond. And they can't tell you why without explaining what they've learned to fear. There's a reason that indigenous elders perform specific ceremonies before entering certain territories. A reason they make offerings, speak prayers, ask permission. It's not superstition. It's recognition that intelligence exists in forms we don't control, that respect is a survival strategy, and that arrogance about human dominance is a luxury you can't afford when something older and more adapted to the environment is watching you. The Wendigo, in traditional understanding, is what happens when humans forget they're part of nature rather than separate from it. When we assume consumption without consequence, dominance without responsibility, survival without respect for boundaries, it's both metaphor and reality, both warning and presence. And in the northern forests, where human infrastructure disappears and wilderness becomes absolute, the distinction between metaphor and reality stops mattering. What matters is survival. What matters is respecting what the land has taught those who've lived on it longest. What matters is understanding that silence from park rangers isn't ignorance or deception. It's wisdom. The wisdom of people who've seen things that shouldn't exist by scientific standards, but do exist in the lived experience of the wilderness. The wisdom of knowing that some truths don't need to be proven to be honored. The files continue to accumulate. The protocols continue to be followed. And the encounters continue to happen, just beyond the reach of definitive documentation, in the spaces where cell phones don't work and help is days away. The northern forests keep their secrets. The Wendigo remains simultaneously legend and reality, existing in the uncertain space where indigenous knowledge, ranger experience, and modern rationalism collide. And the people who know the truth, who've seen the tracks, heard the vocalizations, felt the presence of something predatory and intelligent in the darkness, keep their silence. Not because they don't want to share what they know, but because sharing what they know means creating belief. And belief, according to everything they've learned from the land and from those who came before, is what makes you visible, what makes you vulnerable, what transforms you from observer to participant in something that has been happening in these forests longer than our civilization has existed. The last word belongs to an Anishinaabe elder who agreed to speak with us about traditional knowledge regarding the Wendigo. "You ask why rangers don't talk about it," he said. "You think it's because they'll be ridiculed or because they'll lose their jobs, but that's not the reason. The reason is simpler. The Wendigo is always listening, always aware. When you speak about it, you're acknowledging it, you're giving it attention. And attention is relationship. The Wendigo seeks relationship with humans the way a wolf seeks relationship with deer. You don't want that relationship, so you don't speak the name. You don't tell the stories where it might hear. Rangers who've encountered it understand this instinctively. They've felt what it's like to be noticed by something that shouldn't exist. They've experienced that moment when human confidence evaporates and you remember that we're soft, slow, poorly adapted to the environment, and easy to kill. That moment changes you, makes you careful, makes you quiet, Because loudness, pride, certainty, those are invitations, and you never want to invite the Wendigo's attention. You never want it to know your name. The forest is waiting. The winter is long, and something is moving in the darkness between the trees, patient and hungry, knowing that humans will continue to venture into its territory, because humans always do. Knowing that some of them will disappear, that explanations will be provided, that the silence will hold. Because the alternative, acknowledgement, panic, confrontation, serves no one. Not the public, who would lose access to wilderness they love. Not the rangers, who would lose the plausible deniability that lets them do their jobs. And perhaps not even the Wendigo itself, which has survived for centuries by remaining just beyond belief, just outside confirmation, just hungry enough to feed but never hungry enough to force acknowledgement through excess. The balance holds. The silence continues. And in ranger stations across the northern forests, protocols are followed, warnings are whispered, and new rangers learn the same lesson their predecessors learned. There are things in the deep wilderness that you don't discuss. Not because they're not real, but because they are. And reality, in this case, is something we've collectively decided we're not ready to face. So when you venture into the northern forests, into the territories where the tree line thins and the cold becomes absolute, remember what the rangers know but cannot say. Pay attention to the silence. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Don't investigate sounds that might be calls for help in the deep darkness. Don't follow tracks that don't match any animal you know. And if you see something tall and gaunt moving between the trees with a gait that's almost human but fundamentally wrong, don't try to document it. Don't try to understand it. Just leave. Because the Wendigo has been there far longer than you have. It knows the forest in ways you never will. And it's always, always hungry. The rangers don't talk about it. Now you know why. The question is, will you stay silent too? Or will you be the one who speaks the name in the darkness and discovers too late that some things answer when called?